A nurse finishes a 12-hour shift. She hasn't sat down to eat, she's held the hand of a patient who didn't make it, then walked straight into the next room and smiled for the next one. Tomorrow, she'll do it again. Probably on 4 hours of sleep because the schedule needed her to. You've probably heard the explanation for why nurses burn out 100 times. It's emotionally hard work, it's long hours, it's just the nature of the job. All true. But none of it is the real reason burnout has become a full-blown crisis across the entire profession. The real reason is colder than that, and far more fixable than anyone tells you. Nursing isn't just a calling. Inside every hospital, it's also a line item. And the way hospitals do the math on that line item is quietly breaking the people holding the system together. This is why nurses burn out.
Here's the uncomfortable starting point. In almost every hospital budget, nursing labor is the single largest expense line there is. Not equipment, not medication, people. And when something is your biggest expense, the instinct in any organization, hospitals included, is to look for ways to trim it. That doesn't mean hospital administrators are villains twirling a mustache. It means the incentive built into the system points in exactly one direction. Run staffing as lean as you can legally get away with, because every nurse not scheduled is a cost avoided today. The problem is that today is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Short staffing doesn't eliminate the workload, it just redistributes it onto the nurses who are still on the floor. Fewer hands, same number of patients, same number of emergencies. Someone still has to absorb that gap, and it's never the spreadsheet. That's the starting mechanism behind almost everything that follows in this video. A system that measures the cost of a nurse on the schedule far more easily than it measures the cost of a nurse who isn't.
Here's where it gets genuinely strange, because the short staffing strategy isn't even good math, not by the hospital's own numbers. Recent industry data puts the average cost of losing a single bedside registered nurse at just over $60,000. Recruiting, onboarding, training, lost productivity while a new hire ramps up, all of it adds up fast. For a typical hospital, that turnover adds up to somewhere between $4 and $6 million in losses every single year. Zoom out further, and the pattern gets worse. In some of the highest stress units, emergency departments, step-down units, telemetry floors, turnover has been so severe that these departments effectively replace their entire nursing staff within about 4.5 years. Not because people can't handle the clinical work, because they can't sustain the pace the staffing model demands of them. So why would any organization choose short staffing if it's this expensive to replace the people it burns out? Because the cost of turnover is delayed, diffused, and shows up on next year's budget, while the savings from running lean show up immediately on this quarter's numbers. It's a classic short-term versus long-term trap, except the thing being spent down isn't a budget line, it's a person.
Once that trap is running, it doesn't stay still. It accelerates. Short staffing pushes more work onto the nurses who remain. More patients per nurse, more overtime, less time for the parts of the job that actually feel human. Sitting with a scared patient, explaining a diagnosis clearly, just breathing for a second between rooms. That erosion is exactly what burnout is. Not weakness, not a lack of resilience, but a completely predictable response to being asked to carry more than any one person sustainably can. Burned out nurses leave. Recent data shows job satisfaction in the profession has fallen sharply, down to less than half of nurses reporting they're satisfied, a real drop from just the year before. Nearly a quarter of nurses say they're actively considering leaving the profession entirely within the next year. And when they leave, the unit is short-staffed again, which pushes more work onto whoever's left, which burns out the next round of nurses. This is a real feedback loop, not a metaphor. Short staffing causes burnout. Burnout causes turnover. Turnover causes short staffing. Around and around, and every single loop costs the hospital more than it would have cost to just staff the floor properly in the first place.
If that cycle were the whole story, it would already be bad enough. But there's a detail buried in the economics that makes this genuinely infuriating for the people living it, and it explains a lot of the resentment you'll hear in nursing communities. When hospitals get desperate for coverage, they turn to travel and agency nurses and pay them dramatically more than staff nurses doing the exact same job, sometimes over $100 an hour, well above standard staff pay. Here's why. In hospital accounting, agency spending is treated as a flexible temporary cost, raising the base pay of loyal staff nurses is treated as a permanent liability that follows the hospital's budget forever. So even when it would be cheaper over time to simply pay staff nurses more and keep them, the accounting incentives push hospitals toward the expensive short-term fix instead of the cheaper long-term one. Picture what that looks like from the floor. A nurse who has stayed for years, who trained the new hires, who knows every doctor and every quirk of the unit, watches a traveler walk in for a few months and get paid nearly double for doing the same shifts. The system isn't just burning nurses out. In a very literal financial sense, it's rewarding the people who leave more than the people who stay.
Here's the piece that rarely gets said plainly. A huge number of nurses who are burned out don't leave. Not because the system isn't breaking them, but because leaving isn't financially safe either. Recent surveys found that roughly 4 in 10 nurses say they're staying in their roles purely out of economic necessity. Not passion, not fulfillment, necessity. More than a third report picking up extra shifts specifically because of financial pressure, which means some of the most exhausted people in the building are working more hours, not fewer, because the math at home leaves them no other option. That's the second layer of this system that almost nobody talks about. Burnout isn't just an emotional state. For a lot of nurses, it's what happens when exhaustion and financial dependence collide. When you're too depleted to keep going and simultaneously unable to afford to stop.
So why do nurses burn out? Not because they chose a hard job and couldn't handle it, because they work inside a financial system that measures the cost of staffing them accurately and measures the cost of not staffing them almost not at all, until the bill arrives as turnover, errors, and burned out people who used to love this work. Here's the genuinely hopeful part, and it's real. Because this is a measurable structural problem, it's also a fixable one, and the data is finally forcing that conversation into the open. Hospitals that have invested seriously in staffing ratios, retention, and competitive base pay are the ones actually bending these numbers down. Places that mandated safer nurse-to-patient ratios have seen real improvements, not just in nurse retention, but in patient outcomes. Because it turns out, the thing that protects nurses from burnout is the same thing that protects patients from harm. This was never a wellness problem you fix with a yoga class in the break room. It's a staffing math problem, and math problems have solutions. If you know a nurse, the most useful thing you can do with this video isn't to just feel bad for her. It's to understand that her exhaustion isn't a personal failing. It's a number the system chose not to look at until it was too late. That reframe matters more than it sounds like it does. If breaking down the real economics behind the systems we all depend on is useful to you, subscribe. Every week I take apart something people assume they already understand and show you what's actually happening underneath it. If this connected with you, tell me in the comments whether you're a nurse or you love one. I'll see you in the next one.